Hello, I'm Dennis Galecki. Welcome to the Imagine Greater Buffalo series on Imagine Lifelong Learning YouTube channel. I'm Dennis Galecki. Our guest today is Doug Kohler. Doug is the Erie County historian and will be a featured speaker on the eve of Buffalo Day coming up in August 25th for Buffalo Day. Doug will be speaking at the library at Chautauqua Institution on the day before, Monday, the 24th, at 3 o'clock, 3 to almost 4 o'clock at the library. So this is somewhat of a preview of that. Doug is going to speak and is an expert on the Pan American Exposition held in 1901, the summer of 1901, exactly 125 years ago, halfway, coincidentally, with America's celebration of USA 250. It just works out once, and this is the year for that to happen as a halfway point. So it really connects with our theme of presidents. We'll be looking at McKinley in this presentation and TR, Theodore Roosevelt. But I want Doug to also describe the importance of the Pan Am to our area, but frankly to the country as a means of celebrating itself, its accomplishments, and its culture at that time. And that's what it is, a snapshot of America's culture in the year 1901. So Doug, what got you to this point in life to be the Erie County historian?
Well, my interest in the Pan Am, Dennis, and county historian are two slightly different tracks. County historian had to do with another commemoration. We've been doing commemorations for almost 20 years now. And when we did the War of 1812, I was at a meeting at the History Museum, ironically enough, and we were trying to marshal our resources. And someone said, well, we should reach out to the county historian because by law, every municipality in New York State has to have or is supposed to have a municipal historian, town, village, county, state. And so I just volunteered. I said, well, let me reach out to the county executive's office, see what we can find. And, so I made an inquiry and there was radio silence. And eventually I got a phone call from a former student of mine who was the county executive's chief of staff, who said, we've looked into this. We can't find an appointed county historian, but we would love to talk to you. And the rest literally is history. And I love my time as county historian. And Pan Am, I think, now begins to intersect because as county historian, in the last 17 years, I've really seen my job is telling the good stories, because I think often in Western New York, we get wrapped up in the wide right, 13 seconds, snowstorm, woe is us kind of feeling. And I think that often starts with the Pan Am. And I think, we've got such amazing stories to tell, and the Pan Am is one of them. So I'm excited to be able to share a little bit with you and at Chautauqua in August as well about why I think we need to sort of reconfigure how we view it. My own interest started when I was probably 10 or 12, and I went to an auction with my parents, and I bid on a box that had something totally irrelevant, but in the bottom was a little ticket booklet, and it had the Pan Am on front. And I really don't know that at that point I had a conception of it. And then inside was a picture of a worker. So it was a worker's pass. So the workers had to be photographed, signed it, and then they had a daily ticket that admitted them to the Pan Am grounds. And that began my longtime fascination with the Pan Am. But you ask a really good question, which is, what is its significance not only to Buffalo? And I think we'll come back to that in a second, but in sort of the flow of national history writ large. And that's a little trickier question to answer. I'm working on my doctorate right now on World's Fairs of this era, what we call Victorian fairs or Victorian era fairs, 1850 to World War I, where they're all very similar. They're a focus on consumerism, and we see that at the Pan Am. When you walk down the Court of Fountains, there's a manufacturer's building, there's a agriculture building, there's a transportation building, there are concession stands. This one fair historian has said was the beginning of the mega mall, the shopping mall. So people came to these World's Fairs, and if they didn't buy, they often left with brochures for typewriters and shoes and Singer sewing machines. And I mean, the buildings just were an endless display of American industrial production. So there's that. And then on the other hand, you've also got fairs as, and this gets a little trickier, they're described by planners as educational. And in one sense, they were. It allowed someone in Buffalo to go and see Inuit from the Arctic, to see Plains Indians, to see Africans in darkest Africa, and Hawaiian and Filipino islanders on the Midway. And that's a good thing, because if you lived in Buffalo in 1901, you wouldn't have had a chance to experience that in your life. The problem is that the way in which those cultures were presented were highly stereotypical. They were presented as stereotypes that people from Buffalo going to the Pan Am expected to see, and frankly were racist in their presentation, even if the intention was to educate, to give people in Buffalo or Chicago or St. Louis or wherever a chance to experience cultures they wouldn't otherwise see. But it's the language surrounding them, the presentation surrounding them is not how we would do it in 2026, and frankly, often is very uncomfortable because of the nature of that language. But to answer your question directly, and then we can take a tour of the Pan Am, Buffalo, for some reason, is overlooked. And you would think with an assassination right here, that would put us right in the main discussion. But really, it's the London Fair of 1850 that launches this whole World's Fair phenomenon. The Centennial Exposition, which, as you mentioned, ironically, is, in 1876, 100 years after the country was founded. Chicago, the Wit City, and then St. Louis. And then we kind of fast forward to New York in the 1920s. And Buffalo gets skipped over. My thesis advisor has said, you have to answer the question, why isn't Buffalo in that top tier before my thesis is done? And kind of working on a theory that, it is perhaps because of the tragedy that, we move, I don't want to say we move past it, but it perhaps gets sidelined. And, much like other traumatic events in society, before the era we live in, which we commemorate them. I'm thinking of the upcoming 25th anniversary of 9/11. That wasn't the way society functioned back 125 years ago. So I think in some ways the tragedy of McKinley's assassination may be why, in the large sweep of World's Fairs, we don't always hit that top list with St. Louis and Chicago. Still working on that.
And you'll have an answer before that thesis is over.
I have a year and a half to come up with that answer, so I'm working on it.
All right. Well, this is maybe part of that process. Go ahead. Let's tell us about this. And I'm glad you gave a context. I mean, this is pre-radio, pre-TV. I mean, pre all the ways we connect now. This was your one chance to see a historic moment and what the context for it culturally, the products, the whole bit. So it's an exciting moment for people coming for the first time, people here in Buffalo, a little out of town. Certainly had something to do with electricity, and I'm sure we'll hear about that as well. Take it away.
Yeah. So the Pan Am is largely a reaction to Chicago. Chicago had been the white city. Buffalo is going to be the rainbow city. Chicago had some electric lights. Buffalo is going to have 250,000 light bulbs lighting the fairgrounds. So, I always make the point in my presentations, and I'll bring a picture to Chautauqua of our Ferris wheel. So everything had to be just that much bigger. So George Ferris created the Ferris wheel for Chicago in 1893. Buffalo's Ferris wheel was 15 feet taller because everything had to be just that much better than what they had done in Chicago, including the Midway. But why Buffalo and why 1901? There had actually been plans prior to 1901 to start the fair, but we were at war with Spain. And so the decision was it wasn't really appropriate for a World's Fair when the country was at war. And in a way, that sort of sets the stage for the Pan Am, because now in 1901, the whole theme, and you see it on the Pan American flag, which is that Pax 1901, the peace of 1901. And actually, you might even have a flag there,
I
Dennis?
just happen to have one in case, I don't know if this shows up or not.
But yeah, so in the middle is that eagle, and the
can
eagle
see
holds a banner, and the banner says Pax 1901. And that's why it's Pan-American, to show the sort of the promise of the entire Western Hemisphere, the Americas. And why Buffalo? And this is where it gets interesting, because there are all sorts of myths around the Pan Am about, you know, some of the buildings and some of the events. But the big one is that Buffalo held the Pan Am in 1901 because we had more millionaires than any other city in the United States. And those of us who labor in the Pan Am field, and I'm not going to say that's a whole lot of us, but there are a number of Pan Am enthusiasts. And we often get asked this question about, did Buffalo really have more millionaires? And the answer is no. Just, you know, there is now empirical data, you know, is it per capita? No. Is it straight up? No. I mean, New York had well over 100 times more millionaires than Buffalo. So that's not it, you know, but I don't think the fact that that perception exists changes the reality that Buffalo saw this as a chance to showcase the power of and the industrial growth of the canal, of railroads, of grain elevators, of the industries that were the heart of Buffalo. And this was our chance to really showcase all of that. And that, I think, is why the Pan Am was so important to people in 1901. And even though when you look at cost, and in the end, the Pan Am, for a variety of reasons, was not financially successful, the people at the time did see it as, certainly the millionaires on Delaware Avenue who had bankrolled a lot of this, saw this as achieving that goal of showcasing electric power, of showcasing Buffalo, of showcasing the success that we had experienced as the 8th largest city in the world in 1901. So our perception today and their perception back in 1901 aren't necessarily the same. But I think when you talk about the grounds, Joe, you want me to jump in and talk a little bit about the layout?
Sure.
Great. Because I think this is important. When we talk about this educational piece, and again, goes back to, I don't understand why Buffalo doesn't occupy a different place nationally, is that the ground. So, you know, as our viewers sort of imagine, from Hoyt Lake or the Park Lake on the south, about a mile to the north to the New York Central Railway, and that's still visible. If you go down Elmwood right after Great Arrow, it goes under the train viaduct. And on Delaware, there's a shopping plaza near the Equestrian Center. And then there's a dip and it goes, so the train track is still there. That was the northern end of the Pan Am, almost a mile north to south, half a mile wide from Elmwood to Delaware. And the land had been leased by the Rumsey family, again, one of those scions of Buffalo. And here's the interesting thing. The idea was that it was to be returned after the lease expired from the Pan Am Company. And the ground was to be returned in the same condition in which it had been leased. So all of those buildings are temporary. They're made of a material called staff. It's a mix of gypsum, cement, horsehair, plaster, and it's not permanent. So when you talk about the Pan Am, it takes a year and a half to build. The Pan Am itself is open from May to November, and it was an extremely wet summer in Buffalo, cold and wet. And if you look at pictures from the fall, you can see how the Pan Am buildings had begun to deteriorate, because this material, while it has a certain shelf life, when you expose it to water like that, you know, there are buildings that show mold beginning to get into the plaster, pieces falling off. But ultimately, the design was that when the fair was over, all of those buildings would be knocked down, the canal that surrounded the grounds would be filled in, and the land returned as it was. So that's really, I think, one of the hard parts for us to sort of grasp is the temporary nature. But that's a Victorian era fair thing. It isn't until the last fair of the era in San Diego in 1916 where planners are like, wait a minute, we're spending time, effort, but there's no municipal value. And so they designed the core of the San Diego World's Fair to last. So the buildings were permanent and they're still there. They house the San Diego Historical Museum, and there's a performing art space, if I remember right, an art gallery. But other than that, the goal was always knock it down when the fair's over and move on. And for us in Buffalo, that's true, except the plan was for the Historical Society building, which was the New York State building during the Pan Am. That would be the one building that would survive and sort of be our commemoration of the Pan Am throughout time. And the New York State building would become the home of the Historical Society. As the grounds were laid out, there was a design. And as I said, this was explicit in the, hold on. I have sitting right next to me the official guidebook of the Pan American Exposition. And when you go through here, it talks right at the top about we're showcasing the Western Hemisphere, but we're showcasing progress from lesser developed countries in the southern part of the grounds near today would be Nottingham and Delaware, until you get all the way up to the pinnacle of society, which is the Electric Tower. These soft golds and ivories and seafoam greens, the seafoam of the water as it goes over the crest of Niagara Falls. And so you move from these stark, harsh colors of the undeveloped to the beauty and the sublime spectacle of the Electric Tower. It stood almost as tall as City Hall. It was the progress as you move through. That was the pinnacle of progress, was standing in front of the Electric Tower. And this is all spelled out right in the guidebook. It says, the sculpture shows the progress, the colors show the progress. And yet, while every fair in this era does similar things, ours is unique in that it is literally right there for fairgoers to experience. Yeah, so you see the two figures, and again, that's this whole idea of representing the evolution of society. This is the logo that most people associate with the Pan Am: the rainbow, the city, the spirit of Niagara, sort of the promise of Niagara Falls as the generator of the electricity that's so important. And these are many of the slides that I'll use in the presentation in August. So people who are watching this are going to get literally a sneak peek. We talked about the flag. Here's that Pox 1901. And as you mentioned, the North Star in the top left, the Southern Cross, visible only in the southern tier in the bottom right. And this flag designed by Adelaide Thorpe of the Pan Am Artistic Committee. And here it is hanging on the front of the Michigan building. But these are the grounds that we're talking about. And this, I think, helps people watching us now get a better sense of, you have the lake in the southern part. Today we call it Hoyt Lake. You've got the railroad line. So it's a mile north to south, a half mile east to west. And those colors progress from this area. If you can see my mouse down here, this is the the Court of State and Foreign Buildings, until you get to the Electric Tower up here. And I'll show some images of that in a minute. And not only do the colors progress, but the sculpture progresses as well. So in the southern part, you've got manual labor, and you've got, plows and oxen and people working the fields. And as you get up towards the Electric Tower, you get, the genius of man and wisdom and knowledge. So that progression through the fairground is reinforced in a wide variety of ways. As you entered the grounds, as the planners had intended, you would have come across this bridge, those pylons, 110 feet tall, with inspirational inscriptions on the top. Because again, as we talked about at the top here, education is the goal, even if the way in which it was done is not how we would do it, or does make us uncomfortable today. Buildings were, I think it's important to keep in mind, outlined by lights. So you've got all of these, we said almost 250,000 light bulbs that outline the buildings at night. But then the buildings were designed to showcase particular areas of interest. So this is the horticulture building. And as you look at the pictures, I think it's important to remember that we're in an era of wonderful black and white photography, but not color. So it's hard, here we are 125 years later, to really convey this idea of the rainbow city. And these mailing cards, these are some from my personal collection, give us a better sense of the Spanish Renaissance red tile roofs and the use of color. And in the middle, over that fountain, you see some of that seafoam green that was on every building to unify all of the buildings at the Pan Am. And inside, you saw examples of horticulture. I'm not going to break this one down because I will do that at Chautauqua. So if people really want to know, I'm going to say the nuts and bolts because somewhere in that picture are some walnut shells. I'm gonna leave that reveal for our day out at Chautauqua. But this is the California exhibit. This is the New York State exhibit. This was in the fall, so you see Concord grape wine from Chautauqua County and peaches and grapes and apples. So this was to showcase not only national influence, but also states and localities. Different countries had exhibits in other buildings as well. Across the way was the government building. And having just come off the war with Spain, there was a great fascination with things military. So there were displays of coastal artillery and maps that showed where the American fleet was all over the world at any given time. The Weather Service printed maps over on this wall that you can't, it's just in the corner, right there is the edge of a weather map that the Weather Service printed and distributed daily at the Pan Am. And so that's August 13th, 1901. That lives up on my study wall here. But inside were all sorts of things. There was an exhibit from the Smithsonian that included dinosaur bones, though, again, don't want to give this one away either. We have some questions about this Triceratops, but whether it was real or not, and again, I'll delve into that in August, the fairgoers were fascinated by seeing what they believed to be an actual, in this case, Triceratops skeleton. There were displays from all the different departments of government, the Mint, as I said, the Weather Service. In the patent office, there was an X-ray machine. And again, that figures in when we talk in just a moment here about McKinley. The fact that there was an X-ray machine on the grounds really was significant and perhaps in the unfortunate outcome for President McKinley here in Buffalo. And then as you move sort of up towards the electric tower, different buildings, Temple of Music, ethnology, which again, in that realm of, there was a map of Western New York with indigenous settlements, but there were mummies that had been taken out of burial sites in South America or in Southwestern Ohio, in things that we would not do today as, with a cultural understanding, but they did back then in the name of education, but just sits badly with us today. Again, here's Temple of Music with the view at night. And then again, this gives you just another sense of color. This is the Manufacturing Liberal Arts Building. So we said at the top, this is about consumerism, about buying and selling. And so in here you had all sorts of different items for sale. The trophy on the left is a yachting trophy that was done by the Gorham Silver Company. So you can see the seahorse handle and the mermaids swirling on the base of the cup itself. Tiffany was here with a display of stained glass and wares out of the studio in New York City. Heinz was here with 3 displays of all of their different goods. So if you were looking for one of the 57 flavors and you couldn't find it at one stand, you had 2 other stands that you could go through the Pan Am and find them. And I think this, here's an ad for a corset company that was at the Pan Am. Charles Rolfs, the Buffalo furniture maker, was there with an exhibit. I think this, Dennis, is really sort of what we've missed over the years with the Pan Am, which is what was inside, because often we have the pictures down the Esplanade and the buildings were big and they were temporary and look at all the light bulbs, but we really missed the what did you do there? And so I've tried, in conjunction with a project we're doing at the History Museum, to really dig into the buildings. What was there? What would you see if you had had a chance to spend a day or days at the Pan Am? So here's the electric building, and you see again the falls with that seafoam green. This is the interior, and there's a story here about Edison and Tesla and Westinghouse and the current wars and who was going to power the United States and ultimately the world. And that the fair takes place against the background of sort of that resolution of alternating current versus direct current. And in August, I'll dig a little bit deeper into that as well for the people that are at Chautauqua with us. But then, of course, the pinnacle. Hang on, I have a dog problem. Let's go. Oh. Guys, we had somebody at the door. But you have the pinnacle of sort of the fair, and that's the electric tower. It's the only building that had a steel scaffold, although still that temporary staff material on the outside, because that the only building to be permanent is going to be the History Museum. But with the steel scaffold, there were elevators, there was a restaurant at the 200-foot floor level, there was a winding staircase that went up to an observation deck. But of course, if you heard a rumble of thunder, you did not want to be at the top of that tower because you were in a 400-foot lightning rod. But the views from the top, spectacular. And of course, as we said, I think just, this idea of what it looked like at night, people just were overwhelmed. Not that they hadn't seen electric lighting, but that not certainly on this scale. And the majority of people who came did not have electric lighting in their own house. And in August, we have a video from Edison Company of what that lighting looked like. And then I think the section, and again, to go back to that idea of competing with Chicago, they had a midway. We ought to have a midway, a stadium for UB football and lacrosse contests and track and field events. And there was a sham battle between the Indians and the cavalry, and every day, strangely, the cavalry always seemed to win. Again, in that idea of reinforcing the stereotypes that people who came to the Pan Am expected to see. The midway was elaborate, but it was also closed on Sundays because the clergy of Buffalo saw it as not necessarily fully wholesome entertainment. At the streets of Cairo there to the right of the image, there were belly dancers, and that was not seen as certainly appropriate on a Sunday. And then these images are from the Midway Day Parade through the city of Buffalo, the image here at in front of what is the Central Library. And these are their term, Eskimos. We don't use that term today. It translates roughly as eaters of raw flesh. And not that they were cannibals, but it was not a positive term. So we use Inuit. But you see here the stereotypical representation. They're riding in what's supposed to be an iceberg, and they're dressed in sealskins in, June in Buffalo. And there's caribou antlers. So again, the goal, educational, the execution does not make us comfortable. Plains Indians. I will say this, and again, we'll dig deeper in August, is that while the Plains Indians are heavily presented on one side of the fair, the Pan Am organizers did create a space for the Six Nations, for the Haudenosaunee, separate from the Indian Congress on the Midway, a realization, a recognition that Haudenosaunee culture was not the same as the cultures that were being presented on the other side of the fair at the Indian Congress, literally just outside the door of what is today the History Museum. African Americans are presented, again, in racist, stereotypical ways. And this is deeper than our time this morning, but we will spend a little bit more time with in August about sort of a post-Civil War America. The Pan Am is put on only 35 years after the Civil War ended. McKinley was a Civil War veteran. There were, Civil War displays, but again, the presentation and the stereotypical understanding of what the enslaved people had been like in the South before the war is told from a very Southern standpoint. And of course, totally reimagining what slavery was about. And the language of this exhibit is just not in any way acceptable and appropriate for us today. But this is a stereo card, a very popular souvenir that shows some of the dances that were done if, people went into the old Plantation South concession. And then across the Midway, and not by coincidence, was Darkest Africa, which was a concession sponsored by the Buffalo Society of Natural Sciences, today the Science Museum. Many of the artifacts from here are in the collection of the Science Museum. And they hired the gentleman in the middle wearing the white pith helmet and the white beard. That's Javier Panay, a French mercenary, might be too strong, but not too strong. But a French adventurer in Africa to go and recruit people to come to Buffalo and portray Darkest Africa. Again, not language we're comfortable with, but for someone coming to the Pan Am, this was seen as, they believed that this was what life in Africa looked like, even if for a variety of reasons, there was no real connection between what they were seeing at the Pan Am and the way that these people actually lived back in the equatorial regions of Africa. This is a fascinating one to me because there's a connection between World's Fairs and Walt Disney. Disney knew of the Chicago World's Fair, had gone to San Francisco to World's Fairs, and then, of course, in the 60s, designed concessions for the New York City World's Fair, Small World, World of Motion, the animatronic Abraham Lincoln. And these Trip to the Moon was an immersive ride. And we don't really have time to delve into the whole thing, but it was this immersive experience where people entered this ship. There was rocking and flapping and noises and wind blowing through the cabin by hidden fans. And there were people that believed they were flying and that they had landed on the moon. And there were moon maidens who came through with platters of green cheese, because in 1901, everybody knew the moon was made out of green cheese. And so it's sort of that immersive Disney-esque experience right here on the Pan Am Midway. And this was so successful that eventually Frederick Thompson, who was the concessionaire, took the exhibit to Coney Island, where it lived on long after the Pan Am. But as you said, one of our sort of goals for Buffalo Day at Chautauqua is to talk about presidents of the Pan Am. McKinley, who you see here in a portrait by the Lockport artist Raphael Beck, was intended to come to the Pan Am in May. He was unable to. His wife Ida I want to say she was of poor health, but she had moments where her health impeded her from traveling with him. So in May, he declined to come. He rescheduled to come to the Pan Am, sent Roosevelt in his stead. And Roosevelt was here for a couple of days to open the Pan Am, to process in the parade. His daughter Alice came with him. She rode and writes about rides on the Midway. It's at that time Roosevelt takes his famous walk down Delaware, and he winds up at the Buffalo Zoo. And there's no Secret Service, so he's just out for a typical Rooseveltian stroll in the fresh air. He winds up at the zoo, and people begin to point, and are you Teddy Roosevelt? And the papers cover this walk that Roosevelt makes down Delaware to show up at the zoo. It's interesting. I did this presentation a couple of weeks ago, and a person came up to me after, and they said, "You solved a great standing family riddle." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Our great-great-great-grandfather was a page boy, a runner at the Pan Am, but he said that he had met Roosevelt, and we didn't believe him." And so we were able to sort of unpack it, that in all likelihood, this family's ancestor had met Roosevelt in May, because when Roosevelt comes back in September after the shooting, and the assassination, he's not at the Pan Am. But it is certainly probable that this young boy had met Roosevelt on one of the days that he was at the Pan Am in May. And so, we sort of put the family's mind to rest that, this family legend was, in fact, in all likelihood, true. Again, I know there are others speaking about the assassination, so I won't dig too deeply in, or certainly give away the big reveal after the trial. But I think it may not get mentioned, so I will toss it in here. There's a really interesting portend when McKinley does arrive, which is on September 4th. He comes by train, and he comes first into downtown, and they bring out some brass cannon from Fort Porter, which was down near where the Peace Bridge is. And they fire a salute to the presidential train, but the concussion of the guns is so strong, it blows out the windows in the presidential train. And I've always thought that McKinley should have taken the hint and just kept the train right on moving and not bothered to stop. But of course he does. And September 5th, he spends the day at the Pan Am, gives, as Beck portrays for us here, the famous expositions, or the timekeepers of, I got that wrong, World's Fairs are the timekeepers of progress speech. The next day he goes to the power plant in Niagara Falls by train, an excursion to see the Adams powerhouse that's generating the power for the Pan Am. Comes back to the Temple of Music in the afternoon, and that's where the fateful encounter with Leon Shawgloss takes place. And then there's all sorts of interesting connections between the surgeon Roswell Park, who's not available because he's in Niagara Falls performing surgery, and so McKinley's care is given in the hands of a different physician who's maybe not as experienced. And Had Park been available, would that have led to a different outcome? It's possible. If they brought the X-ray machine over from the patent office, would it have provided a different outcome? It's possible. But I think, and I'll leave this for Spencer Morgan at Chautauqua, is that one wishes for a better outcome for McKinley, and yet I think there's a fair amount of evidence that had McKinley survived and run again, that the administration's tolerance for Teddy Roosevelt was waning. So Roosevelt might not have been on the ticket again. And I think if you look at the Pan Am from that standpoint, in terms of, to go back to your question, the national picture, the Pan Am gives us Teddy Roosevelt. And there's no guarantee that if McKinley doesn't die of his wound here in Buffalo at the Milburn House, that we may not have had a President Roosevelt. And that would alter in almost unimaginable ways the trajectory of the United States afterwards. So the assassination, and I know Spencer will dig into this, is history altering, because if for no other reason, it gives us Teddy Roosevelt after the inauguration at the Wilcox Mansion. And then I guess I sort of would, and then if you have questions that you'd like me to dig into here in whatever time we have remaining, I guess I would throw this out, which is very often, as we look at this picture of the Pan Am as it's being undone in the years after 1901, I think because of the assassination, we get sort of this beginning of that woe is us, maybe Buffalo was cursed because of McKinley. And I think that's a sort of a post hoc ergo propter hoc kind of argument. The things that happen to and, that bring the downfall of Buffalo have nothing to do with McKinley. There are better days of attendance at the Pan Am after the assassination. There are better years from Buffalo after the Pan Am. And so, the fact we connect that a president was assassinated here with the downfall of Buffalo industry, and the fact that we were tasked with reinventing ourselves in the 2000s, which I think we've done a great job of, has nothing to do with McKinley and what took place that day on the Pan American grounds.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Any other shots? To show,
yeah. So
to wrap it up.
This is kind of interesting, just to wrap up, to sort of bring it to the modern day. That once the fair was taken down, that area, so you're looking sort of down Lincoln Parkway, Nottingham is in front of you. That one plot directly in the foreground, I think, is where one of the Mirror Lakes were. And aerial photographs of that area in the 30s and 40s, you can still see sort of the ghostly outlines of the Pan Am grounds as that area finally, and certainly when houses are built in that area, they dig up huge chunks of the buildings that were just sort of buried to return that land to the Rumseys after the lease expired. As we said, there are traces left. The History Museum was designed to be not only for the Pan Am, but for us as a region in perpetuity. And so here's a picture of it on the lakeside during the Pan Am. And of course, we're fortunate that, it still houses such an amazing resource and dynamic presence for us on the Elmwood Avenue Museum Strip even today. A couple other things. The bridge in front is not the first bridge across Scajaquada Creek, but it is the permanent bridge given to the Pan Am by the city of Buffalo. It's called the Bridge of the Three Americas: North America, Central America, South America. And the boathouse has a strong Pan Am connection. It existed in the Olmsted Park system before the Pan Am, but it was damaged by fire at the end of the 1800s and rebuilt by the city in time to be of service for boats going across the lake for people entering the Pan Am from the southern end, from sort of that natural side of things. And then I would finish with this. My favorite resource on the Pan Am is a series of scrapbooks that exist in the collection of the History Museum. They were written by a young teacher named Mabel Barnes, who attended the Pan Am over 30 times with her students, on her own, with friends, and she collected all sorts of ephemera, stuff, handouts, flyers, maps. And over the years after 1901, I think it was 13, 14 years, she compiled them into 3 scrapbooks, which include sort of, you can tell when she's quoting back to where we started, the official guidebook or the book about the Midway. And yet there are these authentic moments. There's one where she describes an engagement with one of the performers at Darkest Africa, and who spoke enough English that he heard her side conversation, and I think creates an understanding in Mabel's mind of Darkest Africa and the people that were in that concession than perhaps what the planners intended. There's a great anecdote about her having spaghetti at Venice in America, where they rented the gondolas, which you may have noticed in some of the images. And, she writes about how now she's had authentic Italian spaghetti. Well, there is no way that the spaghetti at Venice in America was authentic. I've had pasta in Venice. I'm fortunate to have had that experience. And I'm telling you that the pasta in Venice in America did not taste like the handmade pasta that she would have had she ever had the opportunity to go to Venice. But I think, and this is a good place to sort of wrap this piece, it speaks to that sort of all-encompassing, sort of vision that the planners wanted people to have, that when you entered the grounds, the lights, the concessions, the colors, the sculpture, it was all, created just sort of one impression that you were experiencing these cultures in a way that was authentic, even if we can look now 125 years later and go, it was, this was all a design to draw people in and, perhaps have an educational value, but no way could we say that these experiences were authentic to actually, the places around the world they were trying to show.
Doug, this has been a wonderful, it's a big World's Fair here in Buffalo, and you've done a great job of putting this into a small time capsule. Just a couple of observations, because more than a few times you alluded to our sensitivities today, and I'll word this as correctly as I can, our sensitivities today to what people 125 years ago didn't intentionally say, this is terrible, but we'll show it anyways. We're looking through a 125-year-old lens to see something that was meant to show the world what the world looked like by way of Buffalo's Pan-American Exposition. And I often think that we should be kinder in history to appreciate the backward lens through today's lens of values and mores and whatnot. So I think that's what we struggle with, and I this opportunity, I think, of looking back at something gives, and you did a beautiful job in doing that, of just pointing out things that were acceptable and they wouldn't be today. It's as simple as that. Doesn't diminish that they happened 125 years ago, and at least gives us some perspective. And I do that, Doug, in this context. You taught history in a school system. It's often been said that we don't tend to pay as much attention to history as Europeans or other things of that sort. All I know is we seem to be paying a lot of attention, more at the very least recently, and part of it is USA 250, obviously. But so our awarenesses are of that. Do you think this whole stretch that we're in right now is going to result in more interest by kids in history, developing an awareness? Part of my whole program is about Imagine Lifelong Learning around history and the arts and architecture and nature. But what are your thoughts? Is this maybe a more enlightened time relative to interest in history?
I think your point about the Pan Am is right. And it that's my entire doctoral thesis, is presentations of race and gender. And, you're right, because on one hand, we use a 2026 lens to judge, and their intention, I think intention is important. And my point always to any group that I talk about with the Pan Am is it was a reflection of who we were in 1901. This was a country where the Supreme Court had just ruled that separate but equal was within the guidelines of the law. This was a country still trying to figure its way forward out of the Civil War 30 years earlier. It was a country where Jim Crow was reality. And these fairs are snapshots of the country then. But as you said, I think it's important to keep in mind also the intent, as you said, was different than the way we necessarily perceive it today in 2026.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger picture in terms of history, I think certainly locally it's an exciting time. How America 250 plays out nationally, I will not wade into that. I'm a historian, not a politician. But certainly for us here in Western New York right now, we started with 1812, and then we had the canal, and the canal is still ongoing, with the boat and the exhibit we have at Canal Side and programming around it. The August 2nd event is our take on New York State Erie County 250. And we've got the Pan Am. There's exhibits that are opening, and then next year we've got the 200th commemoration of emancipation in New York State, Freedom 2027, and then we've got the bicentennial of the city of Buffalo. And when I say we, I'll put on my Erie County Historical Commission commissioner's hat. We see this as a chance to really strike hard to engage a wide variety of populations, but certainly students. And we do a lot with Civics Day and Constitution Day, and in ways in which we get students into Old County Hall, meeting with legislators to the historic sites, where hopefully this moment, or as I said, we're looking at least right now to 2032 and beyond, that these are when you can celebrate where you live, where the history happened, at a time that intersects with commemorations and bicentennials or 125ths or 250ths. That has a power and a dynamism that we're hoping to really capture and engage this generation of students. Yeah, 100%.
I try to capture that with the term place-based lifelong learning.
For sure.
Right in our own backyard, you can connect to the universe, basically. Doug, could we finish up one way? I've always wanted to do this as part of this Imagine program.
Yeah.
Because that flag, if you can show the image of the Pan Am flag, can you go back and find that? I'd like to just read the description of the Pan American flag. It's very short, but the artistry of the flag, the colors, the images really represent the moment, the idealism, like you said, after a war, the sense of unity, of trying to show us all together, North, Central, and South America, that we are the Americas. And there's the flag. There is a revised flag for this 125th, which I'll point out, Doug mentioned, is going to be posted in different areas. There it is, along different sections of Buffalo, probably in the next couple of weeks, from the sounds of it.
Yep, but we hope by August 1st we're up and running with the light pole banners.
That's true. This recording just a couple of weeks out. So go back to that original flag. The meaning of this flag is as follows. The large white star on the blue field represents the North Star and the cold northern climate. The four small stars on the red field mean the Southern Cross conventionalized. The white bar on which the eagle rests, which with fully spread wings, is meant for the bond of unity. Thus, the red, white, and blue, the colors which are used by almost all republics, are utilized. The eagle, the lofty bird of liberty, holds in its talons the ribbon on which is written Pax, Latin word for peace. And 1901, giving the state of feeling of the different countries of this hemisphere at that date. The points around his head represent the sun as one of the oldest emblems used on any flag in this hemisphere. The palm and pine branches which cross the ribbon represent the North and the South. Thus we get the red, white, and blue, the colors of republicanism, and the green and yellow, which occur in so many of the Southern flags. So colors, images are important, and this is the flag that represented Buffalo at a great moment in its history, 1901. Yes, history happened here, and you're absolutely right in observing the reality that many of us want to and do incorporate in the inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt right here on Delaware Avenue in downtown Buffalo. So that's the favorite president of most presidents, maybe
Yeah.
most people. And he really struck a chord, and it started in Buffalo. It put it together. It made the opportunity that, as you well point out, might not have happened otherwise. It did happen, and that's what I choose to remember of the Pan Am. That is tied to a tragic event, but it's the opportunity suddenly became available, and Teddy Roosevelt ran with it. All right, Doug, this has been wonderful. Thank you. As you're right, we have a current county executive that emphasizes history, local history.
We do.
We've got somebody like you in a position to do that with experience teaching history, and literally every year. I think next year we're already thinking 2027 because of slavery in New York State, as I recall.
Yeah, so it's the 200th anniversary of the emancipation of slavery, that slavery was officially ended as of 1827 in New York State.
And were we one of the first, or were we the 13th one to do it, do you think?
We were kind of in the middle.
Okay.
We were not, weren't first, but we were not way behind the curve. And the commission has a standing committee, and so we're already looking at what planning for that will look like for next year. So
we'll look forward to that.
History doesn't stop.
We'll have you back for that as that develops too.
I look forward to that.
All right. Well done, Doug. Thank you very much. And folks, thank you for watching. This is the Imagine Lifelong Learning YouTube channel you're on. There's other programs. We did 600 programs at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. They're all on audio recordings on Internet Archive. You can find them there. Just search C-SAAHN. I pronounce it C-SAAHN, the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature is acronym. And you'll hear, you can at least hear this and what Doug will be saying at Chautauqua on August 24th. I'll record that and upload it to Internet Archive, so it'll be archived there. And there's 220 YouTube programs at the library, all part of the Imagine Greater Buffalo series, which this program is as well. So thank you. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Be well and good day.